Thank you very much. I'd like to echo the comments that have already been made. Deep gratitude for being invited to be involved in this program, and especially to you, Adalberta, and you, Armando, for your support and all of the tremendous logistics you did behind the scenes to create this wonderful day of conversation and dialogue. Thank you. So, as we know, the Bible does not lack for women characters, and many have truly wonderful characteristics and qualities which religion teaches and Judaism teaches we can emulate. For our discussion today, I thought what would be insightful for our conversation about women's place in society is to take an in-depth look at one story and one character in the form of narrative, in the form of story in which we can see transformation. I will also discuss post-biblically rabbinic Judaism and the conception of women and of gender in the rabbinic period, which has implications for the modern era of the Jewish denominations. So perhaps the most prominent woman in the Hebrew Bible and Jewish heroine par excellence is Esther, the protagonist from the book which bears her name from the section of writings. It's included in the Jewish and Christian canons of the Bible, though my understanding is not included in the Quran, though my understanding also is that its antagonist, Haman, does appear in the Quran. In many ways, the story of Esther is a diaspora story, narrating how a young, orphaned Jewish woman becomes queen and in her broader society. And through this role, she musters the courage to save her people when threatened and when they face the danger of annihilation. The character of Esther has captivated the imagination of Jews and especially of girls as they have dressed up and celebrated this holiday, which takes on very much a carnivalesque character with costume parties and plays to reenact the story. The book of Esther is different from other books in the Bible in that it does not mention God at any point throughout the story. Scholars characterize the genre of the book of Esther as comedic, and of course we could have an extensive discussion of its dating and questions of its historicity or of its metaphorical value. However, within the Jewish tradition, it is important and it serves as a model and inspiration for how to be politically active while also living within a minority community. More recently, the Book of Esther has become a text of interest to feminist scholars, both Jewish and Christian. The narrative shows us not only how Esther navigated being a religious minority, but also how she navigated a society with strong gender distinctions. A close reading of the story allows us not only to look upon and uphold Esther's actions, but also to see how she moved through the situation in which she was raised and living. She moves from a silent and passive character to one who takes initiative and develops strategy. Her story is important as it reveals that people are not automatically influential as leaders, but they become leaders. So methodologically, I'd like to reflect for a moment of how I have read the story. My method for listening and for reading stems from an approach begun as a psychological research method by my mentor in my doctoral studies and the renowned feminist psychologist Carol Gilligan. Gilligan first won acclaim and forever changed the field of psychology when she noticed and challenged that all of psychology's great theories from Erikson and Kohlberg and others were based exclusively on the study of young men's experience. She didn't negate the truthfulness in these theories, but saw them as incomplete. Beginning with her 1993 landmark study, In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development, Gilligan and colleagues developed a method for analyzing first-person interview data called the Listening Guide. I wish we had time to discuss this further, but she basically they integrate a psychological approach to listening to the text and reading the text. Basically, the first step is an exploration of what she calls listening for the plot, which is the cultural context of the interview data, and which, as we'll see, scholars apply to the reading of classical and biblical texts as well. The second step involves what they call listening for the I, which is the unconscious presentation of self in a text, and literally making what they refer to as an I poem. So we could take even my presentation today and pull out all of the I statements and see how I have unconsciously presented myself today. With a biblical text such as the Book of Esther, it's mostly in a third-person narrative, and so we shift from an I poem, and in this case, to a she poem. And then the third is listening for contrapuntal voices, based on psychological understandings that people don't speak in a unified sense of self, but often have different modes of expression, especially in different contexts and different relationships. Tova Hartman, who has been a presenter with you in the past and is featured in the collection of essays, trained with Gilligan and has applied this method to the reading, as I was just mentioning, to this reading of text to classical and biblical texts. She and her co-author, Rabbi Charlie Buchholz, speak especially of reading for supporting characters. By supporting characters, they mean those who provide, quote, the emotional support to the heroes and the moral support to the dominant cultural narratives embodied by the heroes, as well as in the literary sense of not being the main protagonist of a given narrative. Though, of course, in our story of Esther, there is some debate if she's a supporting character or if she is a co-protagonist along with the character of Mordecai. So we use this method to try to hear something new and unearth a new insight, which I find is especially helpful when reading texts for women's voices and for understanding gender dynamics. So briefly, for the first listening for the plot. The plot of the story is that Esther becomes queen through winning a beauty contest after King Ahasuerus has banished his previous wife, Vashti, when she would not obey him by coming to his party. I will just back up and say during the second wave of feminism, Vashti became very much upheld as a role model for resistance. So interestingly now, there's been a movement to also claim Esther as a feminist role model, or role model for women who stay within the system and find ways for their greater actualization. So Esther is instructed by her cousin and guardian Mordecai to keep her Jewish identity secret. And later in the story, Mordecai learns of an evil plan to assassinate the king. And And so Esther musters the courage to approach the king against protocol. I'll come back to this point shortly. When we listen in that second reading for the verbs which are used regarding Esther, as I mentioned, we see a tremendous transformation. At the beginning of the story, Esther literally has no voice, and we are told that Mordecai, who is her foster father and uncle, takes her in. And then we read, and she was shapely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai literally took her in as his daughter. Continuing with the analysis of the verbs that are used, this verb of taking, lakach in Hebrew, also applies to how she is brought into the palace of the king. Another verb frequently used is that she is commanded. Mordecai commands her or instructs her to not reveal her Jewish identity. The first active verb, so the first indication of transformation, occurs when Mordecai learns some information which would be helpful to the king, and Esther shares that with the king. So that's the beginning of transformation. One other active verb, which I believe is, we could have some discussion and debate, is the verb she found favor. So, of course, I'm translating here, and there's a few different versions in the Hebrew, but I find that to be a very intriguing active verb because it also has a certain sense of passivity. Finding favor in this context is about the presentation of self, and specifically for the purpose of being pleasing to be seen. And then in the initial part of the story, we also read that twice we read a negative verb, that she chose not to speak. Throughout the story, we see transformation in her name as well as in her identity becoming known by the end of the story. So we could ask ourselves, where is the part that this transformation really took place, and what can we learn from it? So looking at the verbs, we see that the actual dramatic transformation took place in the next chapter from what I described of her reporting to the king about the information that her guardian Mordecai and cousin Mordecai shared. So in the, I'm sorry, I'm just skipping ahead here so I don't read it all. So in the next section, Mordecai himself comes into some trouble and he fears for his life, and he sends a message to Esther to report that to the king. And at this point, we have a very surprising response from Esther. The Torah, or the Tanakh here, the book of Esther, writes, all the king's courtiers and the people of the king's, that she reported back to him, all the king's courtiers and the people of the king's provinces know that if any person, man or woman, enters the king's presence in the inner court without having been summoned, there is but one law for him, that he be put to death. Only if the king extends his golden scepter may he live. Now I have not been summoned to visit the king for the next 30 days. So here we find a very surprising response from Esther, a sense of pushback. In the previous chapter, she had just entered of her own initiative to meet with the king. And here she's quoting the law, saying she can't help Mordecai because of this law. It's curious. So Mordecai sends a next message back, which we won't go into all of the details for, but in the end, Esther acquiesces, but not exactly. She will help Mordecai, her relative, as I mentioned, but upon her own instruction, she extends the following message back to him: to go assemble the Jews in Shushan and fast on my behalf, and she gives more instruction to him for how to navigate the calamity. Here the text is showing us Esther's command of the situation and her instruction and her instructions. Her role and Mordecai's role have now reversed. Now Esther is in the position to exercise her authority, and we also see other aspects of her leadership. She demonstrates knowledge of the law and knowledge of how she strategically devises a plan for navigating the law. We also see a pastoral aspect to Esther's leadership. She institutes a fast as a spiritual practice for herself and her community during this crisis. This transformation in her relationship with Mordecai, where she is not only the receiver of instruction, but also one who gives instruction, is followed also by a transformation in her relationship with her husband, the king. Up until this point, she found favor in his eyes. Following this interaction, she approaches him and he asks her a question. All of their interactions for the rest of the book are ones of conversation and one of questions and answers and dialogue. Toward the end of the book of Esther, we read about the institution of the holiday of Purim and about its traditions. In a manner that seems characteristic of Persian culture, a theme throughout the book is the writing of written records. Mordecai recorded the records, and he gave written instructions for the holiday. But then we read, toward the very end of the book, then Queen Esther, daughter of Avichail, wrote a second letter of Purim for the purpose of confirming with full authority the aforementioned one of Mordecai. So this, to me, is actually quite extraordinary. It's the first instance I know of a Jewish woman's writing, and that it happens within the biblical context is quite amazing. And then, so just to conclude my discussion of Esther, it's important to note here that Esther's leadership does not displace Mordecai or Ahasuerus. She remains in relationship with them and supports their leadership while simultaneously asserting her own. At the end, I'll come back to a few recommendations we can apply from this reading of the book of Esther. So I'd like to now, in the next few minutes, make a connection from this story to current day Judaism. But first, I'd like to take a moment to pause and acknowledge that when we talk about current day Judaism, we are talking about the rabbinic period, which began after the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era. That both likely started before the destruction of the temple, but most definitely after that Judaism transitioned to a synagogue, prayer, and study form of religion. The teaching of the rabbis during this period were canonized into the works called the Mishnah and the Talmud during the first 600 centuries of the Common Era. These texts draw from the Bible, but have a different organizational structure. They've laid the foundation for halakha, Jewish law, which literally means the way, guidelines for how to live. And as a parenthetical note, the distinction between faith and culture are very much intertwined in Judaism. Whoops, I'm sorry. Okay. So in this context, I'd like to discuss the role of women in Judaism. Halakha is historically a gendered legal system. While we say that there are 613 commandments, and most of them apply equally to men and to women, there are ones that are gender specific that have great impact on the lives of men and women and girls and boys in society. The mitzvot, or the commandments, which have been primarily applied to men, are ones that fit a category called positive time-bound commandments, meaning that they need to be performed in a specific time period. It was believed that women should be exempt from these, as they historically had childcare and domestic responsibilities. So examples of these commandments, which would be required of men and not of women, are praying 3 times a day, wearing a prayer shawl, talit, putting on the tefillin, the phylacteries, and counting towards a prayer quorum of 10 adult Jewish men needed for a prayer service. But there were also commandments that were specifically for women, and the 3 that are most frequently referenced are the baking of the challah bread and a certain commandment of separation with blessing in reference to the temple. And the challah bread would be the bread eaten on the Sabbath and holidays to signify its sanctity as a day. The lighting of candles for the Sabbath and holidays, and also certain aspects of going to the ritual bath and observance of family purity laws. While not exclusively, the male-gendered commandments are prayer-focused and extend to the public sphere, and the female-gendered commandments are located in the family and the home. Additionally, there have been aspects of Jewish culture and society and organization which have affected men and women differently, specifically the role of men as religious authority figures. So in the modern era, gender has been a core issue, if not one of the most core issues for denominational differences and practice. So of course, as with all of us, there's much we could say about each denomination, and each has its own diversity and historical development within itself. But simply stated, I'll offer a few comments. One core distinction between the denominations is the understanding of Torah in terms of its sanctity or its God-givenness versus its being a product of human development. And of course, there's much variation. And so, of course, another intersecting a philosophical question that would influence the denominations also is an understanding of gender and if gender is a social construction or if there's something essentially different. So believing that halakha is divinely commanded, orthodoxy has tended to retain gender distinctions in Jewish life. I'm saying has tended to because you'll hear by the end there are also developments within orthodoxy. So women often play organizational leadership roles. Those are not roles within the religious, the prayer context, the liturgical context. In the Reform and Progressive movements, which tend to emphasize the autonomy of the individual and sees the individual as authorized for decision-making, halakha is often thought of as a resource for meaning and spirituality to be practiced or not practiced by the individual. There's a different implication on whether or not halakha is automatically commanding and binding versus serving as a resource to be used or not used, accessed or not accessed as the individual sees. The denomination I'm ordained in, the conservative movement, ordained its first woman in 1986. This was about 14 years after the Reform movement in the United States ordained its first woman. The conservative movement espouses an approach to Jewish law that the law is binding and also historically evolving. So when it comes to these positive time-bound commandments I was referencing a few minutes ago, one thinker in the conservative movement, Rabbi Judith Hauptman, has argued that the original rabbinic texts that excluded women from these roles did so not based on gender, but based on social status. And she argues now that women are of equal social status, they should be fully considered obligated and therefore included. Now, another rabbi in the conservative movement, Rabbi Joel Roth, didn't like this approach because he said it would make, and to quote him in a kind of colloquial way, he said, "I don't want to make my grandmother a sinner," meaning he doesn't want to read back that for the last 1,500 to 2,000 years, women have been obligated to something that they have not been fulfilling. So what he argued for was what he calls the taking on of a chiyuv, or of an obligation. So he said, just like when a person converts to Judaism, they take upon themselves commandments that they were not previously commanded for, like, let's say, keeping kosher. There's no need to keep kosher if one is not Jewish and in the traditional framework. So he says, similarly, a woman can take on commandedness towards the historically male commandments. Within the last few years, there has been a significant engagement within modern Orthodoxy regarding women's roles and the beginning of ordaining women within the Orthodox context. And coming back to your point about titles, in the what's called the Yeshivat Maharat, each ordained woman chooses her title. So rabbi, rabbanit, and some other options. So I'd like to add that there's also another way to understand the historically developing roles of women, which are not only entering into historic contexts, but also the creation of new religious roles. And so, as was mentioned, I work in the chaplaincy field, and this has been an area of a new realm of religious leadership, which women, whether they come from one with gender equality or one without gender equality, ordaining women or not ordaining women, can become full participants and leaders with authority and respect in that context. So to conclude, I'd like to offer a few recommendations. So within the Jewish community specifically, the mechanism for creating gender egalitarianism within the liberal movements has been largely in one direction, of finding mechanisms for women to enter into the realm of men's historic functioning. As I was saying, praying, leading services, wearing the prayer shawl. For true gender equality, we also need to look in the other direction, for men to take on and value that which has been historically gendered as feminine. So the lighting of candles, the baking of challah, etc. Even when there has been a policy or a halachic decision for gender equality, it has been an incomplete process. After the policies have been have been changed for gender equality in the liberal segments, the process of cultural change has been slow and not fully embraced, with women continuing to experience subtle forms of gender discrimination. And of course, these need to continue to be tended to. For the segments of the Jewish community which do not embrace gender equality, the recommendation, of course, for them is to continue to explore as the extent as far as possible for women's actualization and leadership within these contexts. I argue also for a feminism that incorporates men, as we had a discussion earlier. And I'm reminded of a quotation by Carol Gilligan, who I mentioned earlier, who does identify herself as a feminist. And she says, for her, feminism is one of the great liberation movements. It is the movement to free democracy from patriarchy. And so feminism is not intended to privilege women, but rather to help affect a more democratic society. And interestingly, her work has also included the psychological study of boys and of men as well. Two final notes. In the book of Esther, I mentioned briefly, her name becomes more fully known throughout the book, from Hadassah, which is her Hebrew name, to Esther, her Persian name, sometimes mentioning her parents, sometimes mentioning her Jewish identity, and at the end of the book, it is all together. And so a recommendation that I have for us is an attention to names and titles and a societal phenomenon which women in leadership positions in my religious communities are often familiar with, is often the omitting of the religious title for women. And then finally, the significance of women creating written records and written words and having their works published. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good.